The Blind Woman's Curse. Good evening, listeners, and welcome back to the space between the shadows, the quiet corner where nightmares gather. This is Eli Nightfall. Tonight we talk about legacies, not the kind measured in wealth or property, but the darker inheritances. The burdens passed down not through wills and testaments, but through blood, through whispers, through objects that hold more than just memories. We talk about curses, specifically about her curse, the blind woman's curse. There are things in this world, objects crafted by human hands, that seem to absorb the essence of their creators. Joy, love, dedication. These can linger, giving an old rocking chair a comforting creak, or a worn photograph a warm glow. But what about the other emotions? What about bitterness? Obsession? What about a rage so profound, a pain so deep, it refuses to die with the flesh? What happens when that bleeds into wood or clay or porcelain? Imagine an antique doll, not one of those mass-produced plastic things with vacant smiles, but something older, something meticulously crafted. Porcelain skin so smooth it feels almost real under your fingertips, cheeks delicately rouged, lips pursed in a serene, almost knowing expression. Hair like spun silk, perhaps slightly matted with age, and eyes of brilliant, startlingly clear glass. They catch the light in a way that seems aware. Unblinking, always watching. This doll exists. Her name, whispered only in hushed tones within the family that has unwillingly sheltered her for generations, is Lila. But the world, or rather, the small, frightened corner of the world that knows of her, remembers her only by the shadow she casts, the shadow of the blind woman's curse. The story begins, as so many unsettling tales do, with an inheritance. Not a grand estate or a glittering fortune, but a dusty crate pulled from the attic of a recently deceased great-aunt, a woman known for her eccentricities and her reclusive final years. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens and moth-eaten shawls, lies Lila. To Sarah, the recipient, a young woman more concerned with navigating the concrete jungles of modern life than the dusty corridors of the past, the doll is initially little more than a curiosity, a slightly creepy, perhaps valuable piece of family history. She remembers vague stories, dismissed as grandmotherly superstition, about a doll that brought bad luck, watched over by a distant ancestor. A blind artisan from the late 1800s who lived in a secluded cottage somewhere in rural New England, a place called Black Creek Hollow. The artisan, history doesn't even remember her name clearly. She's just the blind woman. Legends paint her as both gifted and tormented. They say her fingers possessed a sight her eyes lacked, that she could sculpt faces from memory, capturing likenesses with unnerving accuracy. But they also whisper of a darkness within her, a bitterness born of her affliction, or perhaps something older, more sinister. They say she poured her frustrations, her loneliness, her rage, into her final creation, a doll made in the image of the daughter she never had, or perhaps the daughter she lost. A doll with eyes designed to see everything her creator could not. Sarah, practical Sarah, sets Lila on a bookshelf in her modern, minimalist apartment. An odd juxtaposition, the antique doll with its unsettling gaze amidst the sleek lines and cool tones. At first, nothing happens. The doll is just there, a silent, porcelain witness to Sarah's life. But then the subtle wrongness begins. A misplaced object, a door found slightly ajar when she was certain she'd closed it. The distinct feeling, late at night, of being watched. Even when she's alone, she catches glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, always near the bookshelf, but when she turns, nothing. Just Lila, smiling her serene, porcelain smile. Sleep becomes elusive. When it does come, it's filled with fractured, disturbing dreams. Whispers in the dark that seem to emanate from the doll's direction. Images of a dark cottage, gnarled trees clawing at the windows, and a feeling of unseen eyes pressing in from all sides. She wakes with a gasp, heart pounding, sweat cold on her skin. the doll's glass eyes gleaming faintly in the ambient city light filtering through her window. She tries to rationalize it. Stress from her job, grief over her gray tant's passing, an old building settling. But the incidents escalate. Friends visiting the apartment comment on the doll, an undercurrent of unease in their voices. One friend, Jessica, refuses to stay overnight after waking up convinced she saw the doll standing at the foot of the guest bed. Sarah laughs it off, but the seed of fear, once planted, begins to sprout roots. Twining around her rational mind, she starts researching, digging into forgotten family lore, searching online databases, trying to piece together the history of the blind artisan of Black Creek Hollow and her unsettling creation. The whispers she dismissed as superstition now take on a chilling significance. Tales of misfortune befalling previous owners, sudden descents into paranoia and delusion, unexplained accidents. A pattern emerges, stretching back generations, always circling back to the doll. Always back to Lila. The doll itself seems different now. Has the pain on its lips always curled into such a knowing smirk? Were its eyes always that shade of piercing blue? So lifelike, they seem to hold a glint of cold intelligence. Sarah finds herself talking to it, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. She covers it with a cloth, locks it in a closet. But the feeling of being watched persists, stronger now, as if the doll resents being hidden. The whispers in her sleep become clearer, forming fragmented words, weaving a tale of betrayal, isolation, and a promise of eternal vengeance tied to the doll's very existence. This, listeners, is where our story truly begins, with Sarah standing on the precipice, staring into the glass eyes of an inheritance she never wanted, feeling the first cold tendrils of the blind woman's curse tightening around her soul. The doll is more than just porcelain and paint. It is a vessel, a prison, and a key. The question is, what door is it about to unlock within Sarah? And could she possibly hope to close it again? Stay with me now as we turn the first page, as we step into Sarah's increasingly fractured world, and as we begin to unravel the chilling secret held within those empty, watching eyes. The first chapter begins now. Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Glass. The call had come on a Tuesday, wedged between a tedious budget meeting and the frantic rush to meet a looming deadline. Sarah Carmichael, navigating the pixelated labyrinth of spreadsheet cells, had initially let the unfamiliar number go to voicemail. Work was a demanding beast, a relentless cycle of targets and deliverables that left little room for unscheduled interruptions. But the caller, a solicitor with a voice as dry as autumn leaves, had been persistent. Great-aunt Elspeth had passed away, quietly, in her sleep, in the sprawling, Gothic house overlooking the choppy gray waters of Cabot Sound, Maine, a house Sarah hadn't visited since she was barely tall enough to peer over the heavy oak windowsill. The solicitor informed her with practiced neutrality, the matter of the will. Elspeth, it turned out, had never quite forgotten her grandniece, the quiet, bookish child who'd once spent a rainy afternoon utterly captivated by the intricate workings of a dusty Victrola in the corner of the cavernous library. Sarah, 32 now, a senior marketing analyst living in a characteristically characterless Boston apartment, was named as a beneficiary, not of the house that went to some distant historical society, nor of any significant funds, but of Elspeth's personal effects, a vague term that conjured images of mothballed clothes and tarnished silverfish. Still, obligation, mixed with a faint, nostalgic curiosity, prompted her to agree to the arrangements. A few weeks later, a shipping company deposited a surprisingly large, rough wooden crate in the middle of her meticulously tidy living room. It sat there for 2 days, an incongruous block of weathered pine amidst the cool grays and clean lines of her IKEA-furnished life, smelling faintly of dust, camphor, and something else, something indefinably old and stagnant. Finally, on a Saturday morning armed with coffee and a crowbar borrowed from her building's super, Sarah confronted the crate. The wood groaned in protest as she worked the nails free, rusty shrieks echoing in the quiet apartment. Inside, packed tightly with yellowed newspaper brittle with age, headlines spoke of Eisenhower and Cold War anxieties, lay the promised personal effects. There were indeed moth-eaten shawls, smelling pungently of neglect, a box of tarnished silver lockets, empty save for dust, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, the ink on the pages spiderwebbed and illegible. And then, nestled deep within a cocoon of disintegrating velvet, she found it. The doll. Sarah wasn't sure what she'd expected, but it wasn't this. It was exquisite, unnervingly so. About 18 inches tall, with a porcelain head, shoulders, and limbs attached to a firmly stuffed cloth body. The porcelain had the smooth, cool feel of polished bone under her hesitant touch, painted with a delicate, lifelike blush on the cheeks and lips. Its dress, a confection of faded cream lace and tiny seed pearls, was remarkably preserved, though stiff with age. The hair, a cascade of dark, silky curls, felt disturbingly real. But it was the eyes that arrested her. Large, startlingly blue glass eyes, fringed with delicate, real lashes. They stared straight ahead with an unnerving lack of vacancy. They didn't look at her, not exactly, but they seemed aware, possessed of a serene, watchful intelligence that felt utterly out of place on a child's plaything. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible chip near the iris of the left eye, a flaw that somehow made the gaze seem even more focused, more intentional. Sarah lifted the doll carefully from its velvet shroud. It was heavier than she expected, with a solid, dense feel. Tucked into the folds of its dress was a small, yellowed card, inscribed with elegant, spidery script. Lila. Below the name, barely legible, were the words she sees. Cryptic, slightly melodramatic. Typical great-aunt Elspeth, Sarah thought with a flicker of amusement, remembering the woman's flair for the theatrical. Her whispered stories of spectral hounds and haunted heirlooms, stories Sarah's pragmatic mother had always briskly dismissed. "Your great-aunt has an overactive imagination, dear," she'd say. "Pay it no mind." Sarah had largely obeyed, consigning Elspeth's tales to the dusty attic of childhood memory. Yet, holding Lila now, a prickle of unease ran down her spine, an involuntary echo of those half-forgotten fireside stories. The doll's faint, fixed smile seemed less serene up close, more knowing, perhaps even mocking. The way the light caught those glass eyes, it was unnerving. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling. It was just a doll. An old, exceptionally well-made, slightly creepy doll. Probably quite valuable, too. She considered selling it. Antique dolls could fetch a pretty penny, couldn't they? But a strange reluctance stayed her hand. It was, after all, the most significant part of her peculiar inheritance. A tangible link to the enigmatic great-aunt Elspeth and a past Sarah knew little about. With a sigh, she decided to keep it, at least for now. Finding a suitable spot proved awkward. It didn't belong on the sleek, minimalist coffee table. It looked absurd perched on the kitchen counter. Finally, she cleared a space on the bookshelf flanking her faux fireplace, between a stack of marketing textbooks and a collection of contemporary poetry. Lila sat there, upright and still, her lace dress spilling over the shelf edge, her glass eyes surveying the room with that unsettling, passive awareness. An odd sentinel in a modern world. Sarah forced herself to turn away, busying herself with unpacking the rest of the crate's less dramatic contents, determinately pushing the doll and its unnerving gaze to the back of her mind. The first few days passed uneventfully. Lila remained on the shelf, a silent, decorative anomaly. Sarah worked, ate, slept, her routine absorbing her attention. She'd catch sight of the doll occasionally, a flicker of porcelain white in her peripheral vision as she passed through the living room, but she deliberately avoided looking directly at it. Yet, the feeling began subtly, a sense of not being entirely alone, even when the apartment was empty. She turned suddenly, convinced someone had stepped into the room behind her. only to find nothing but still air and the impassive stare of the doll from its perch. She started misplacing things. Her keys, a specific file she was sure she'd left on the table, her favorite pen. Minor annoyances, easily attributable to stress and fatigue, yet they clustered with unusual frequency after the doll's arrival. Then came the faint noises, a soft rustle, like silk brushing against wood, seeming to come from the bookshelf when there was no draft. A faint creak from the floorboards nearby, long after she'd settled into bed. Once, she thought she heard a sigh, soft and almost inaudible, hanging in the air just as she drifted towards sleep. She snapped awake, heart hammering, straining her ears in the darkness. Silence. Only the distant hum of city traffic and the rhythmic ticking of the cheap digital clock on her nightstand. She told herself it was the building settling, old pipes groaning, the neighbors. Boston apartments were full of strange noises. Still, her eyes invariably flickered towards the living room, towards the bookshelf she couldn't quite see from her bed. A knot of unease tightening in her stomach. One night, about a week after Lila's arrival, Sarah jolted awake from a deep sleep. No sound had woken her, no specific disturbance. It was a feeling, a primal sense of being observed. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight filtering through a gap in the blinds. She lay perfectly still, scarcely breathing, listening. Silence. Yet the feeling intensified, prickling the hairs on the back of her neck. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head towards the open bedroom door, peering into the shadowed living room beyond, and her breath caught in her throat. Moonlight struck the bookshelf, illuminating the space where Lila sat. Except she wasn't sitting perfectly upright anymore. The doll was slumped slightly forward, its head tilted at an angle, its dark, glass eyes seeming to stare directly, unerringly, into Sarah's bedroom. Directly at her. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over Sarah. It had moved. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she had left it sitting perfectly straight. It had moved. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. Her body was rigid, locked in a primal fear that turned her blood to ice water. The moonlight seemed to pool around the doll, isolating it, making the rest of the apartment recede into indistinct shadows. It was just her and Lila, locked in a silent, terrifying tableau across the threshold. The doll's head, tilted just so, gave its fixed smile a predatory quality, a silent mockery. She sees. The word from the yellowed card screamed in Sarah's mind, no longer cryptic, but a chilling declaration. Had always been slumped like that? No, impossible. She had placed it meticulously, ensuring it sat perfectly upright, a small act of asserting order over the unsettling object. She remembered fussing with the lace dress, smoothing it down. It had been straight. She knew it. A tremor started in her hands, spreading up her arms. Her mind raced, scrabbling for logic, for any explanation other than the impossible truth. Vibration? Had a truck rumbled past outside, shaking the building just enough? But the bookshelf was solid oak, heavy, wedged tightly against the wall. Nothing short of an earthquake should have shifted the doll like that. Had she somehow knocked it when passing earlier, forgetting the incident entirely? No. She'd been careful, giving the bookshelf a wide berth, acutely aware of its unnerving occupant. Could it be settling? The cloth body compressing slightly under the weight of the porcelain head? It sounded plausible, almost comforting in its mundane physics. But the angle, it wasn't just slumped, it was tilted, oriented towards her doorway, towards her. That intentionality, imagined or real, was what sent shards of ice through her veins. Fight or flight. The ancient imperative surged through her. Flight screamed retreat, pull the covers over her head, pretend it wasn't happening. But another part of her, the stubborn, analytical part that dissected marketing trends and demanded concrete data, refused to yield to blind panic. She needed to see. She needed to know. Slowly, agonizingly, Sarah pushed back the duvet. The movement felt loud in the oppressive silence, the rustle of fabric echoing like a gunshot. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cool wood of the floor. Each step towards the door was leaden, her muscles protesting, her nerves screaming warnings. The living room seemed vast and threatening, the familiar furniture casting long, distorted shadows. The doll remained motionless on its shelf, its glassy stare unwavering, fixed on the space where she stood. As she reached the doorway, she paused again, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could smell the dust from the crate faintly, mingling with the scent of old porcelain and something else, something dry and vaguely floral like desiccated potpourri. Standing closer, she could see the chipped edge of the left iris more clearly, a tiny flaw that seemed to draw the moonlight, making the eye glitter with uncanny life. The tilt of the head was undeniable now, not a random slump, but a definite inclination. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Sarah forced herself forward, crossing the threshold into the living room. The air felt colder here, heavier. She approached the bookshelf slowly, her gaze locked on Lila. The doll's serene expression seemed to tighten as she drew nearer, the painted smile taking on a chilling ambiguity. Was that a glint of malice in those blue depths, or just a trick of the light? She stopped directly in front of it, close enough to touch. The porcelain skin looked unervingly smooth, almost luminous in the dim light. The tiny pearls on the dress seemed to gleam like miniature teeth. Hesitantly, her hand trembling, Sarah reached out. Her fingers hovered over the doll's shoulder for a second, the space between her skin and the porcelain crackling with static tension. Then she touched it. The porcelain was cold, profoundly cold, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her fingertips, radiating up her arm. It felt wrong, ancient. She flinched back instinctively, snatching her hand away as if burned. But the contact had broken the spell of paralysis. With renewed, albeit terrified, resolve, she reached out again, grasping the doll firmly by its cloth torso. It felt dense, solid. She straightened it carefully, setting it back into its precise, upright position, ensuring the head faced directly forward, the eyes staring blankly at the opposite wall. The act felt both necessary and transgressive, like correcting a misbehaving child, while simultaneously fearing its silent retribution. She stepped back, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the doll for any sign of movement, any subtle shift. Nothing. Lila sat perfectly still, restored to her proper place, her expression once again placid, unreadable. Yet, the room didn't feel safe. The sense of violation lingered. Straightening the doll hadn't banished the wrongness. It had only temporarily contained it. The knowledge that it could move, that it had moved, or that she was losing her grip on reality so profoundly that she believed it had, left a residue of fear that coated everything. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound, charged with an expectant tension. Sleep, she knew, was now impossible. Sarah retreated to the relative safety of her bedroom, but left the door slightly ajar. Unable to bear the thought of shutting the doll out of sight completely, needing to know, paradoxically, that it remained where she had put it. She lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness. Her senses hyper-alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, every whisper of wind against the window pane seemed amplified, potentially sinister. She imagined the doll slowly tilting its head again, its glass eyes finding her in the dark. She pictured it climbing down from the shelf, its porcelain feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The images flickered behind her eyelids, fueled by exhaustion and burgeoning terror. Hours passed. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed mockingly. 3:17 a.m., 4:02 a.m., 4:48 a.m. When the first gray hints of dawn finally began to dilute the oppressive darkness, bleeding through the blinds, Sarah felt a sliver of relief, fragile though it was. Daylight brought with it a semblance of rationality. The harsh edges of nighttime, fears softened by the familiar routines of morning. She rose stiffly, her body aching from tension. Lila sat exactly as Sarah had left her hours before, perfectly upright, eyes forward, serene. There was no outward sign of the terrifying nocturnal shift. Looking at it now, bathed in the ordinary light of morning, Sarah felt a flicker of doubt. Had she dreamt it? Had exhaustion and the inherent creepiness of the doll conspired to create a waking nightmare? The memory felt so vivid, so real. The tilted head, the focused gaze, the bone-deep chill when she touched it. But here it sat, inanimate, harmless. Just a doll. Yet, the fear hadn't entirely receded. It lurked beneath the surface of her forced calm, a cold knot in her stomach. Dream or reality? The incident had irrevocably altered her perception of the object. It was no longer just a peculiar inheritance. It was a source of profound dread, a watchful presence that had breached the boundaries of the mundane and whispered a terrifying suggestion of the impossible. The blind woman's curse, the phrase echoed in her mind, no longer sounding merely like fanciful folklore. It felt like a warning. And looking into Lila's impassive glass eyes, Sarah had the sickening feeling that the warning had come too late. Chapter 2. The Weaver's Secret. The cold light of day did little to truly dispel the chilling residue of the night before. Sarah moved through her morning routine with a forced, brittle efficiency. The image of the doll's tilted head and watchful eyes superimposed over every mundane task. Making coffee, showering, dressing for work, each action felt detached, performed by rote while her mind wrestled with the lingering fear and the gnawing uncertainty. Had she imagined it? Hallucinated the entire terrifying episode? The rational part of her clung to that possibility, seeking refuge in explanations of stress, grief, and an overactive imagination inherited, perhaps, from great-aunt Elspeth herself. But the visceral memory, the profound cold of the porcelain, the unnerving intentionality of the doll's gaze, resisted easy dismissal. It felt real. Too real. At work, the fluorescent hum of the office seemed louder, the cheerful chatter of colleagues grating. She found herself staring blankly at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring into meaningless patterns. Her focus, usually laser-sharp, kept fracturing, pulled back to the image of Lila sitting silently on her bookshelf miles away. Was the doll still facing forward? Had its head tilted again, even slightly? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her, making her shiver despite the office heating. She found herself glancing towards the reflective surface of her monitor, half expecting to see the doll's reflection peering back over her shoulder. She jumped when her phone buzzed, her heart leaping in her throat before she realized it was just an email notification. This couldn't continue. The uncertainty was as corrosive as the fear itself. Ignoring it, pretending it hadn't happened, was clearly not an option. The doll, and the disquiet it exuded, had become an unwelcome occupant not just of her apartment, but of her mind. She needed answers. She needed to understand what, exactly, she had inherited along with great-aunt Elspeth's personal effects. That evening, bypassing her usual routine of takeout and mindless television, Sarah sat down at her laptop. The doll perched silently on the bookshelf across the room, its presence a palpable weight. She felt its glass eyes on her back as she typed, a sensation that made her skin crawl. Taking a steadying breath, she opened a search engine. Where to even begin? She started broadly, antique porcelain doll Lila. The results were predictably useless. Thousands of images of dolls. Collector sites, eBay listings for dolls named Lillian or Lila, none resembling the unsettling figure watching her. She refined the search. Porcelain doll blue glass eyes lace dress. More images, closer perhaps, but still generic. Nothing captured the specific, unnerving quality of Lila's stare, the almost smirk on her lips. She shifted tactics, focusing on provenance. Great-aunt Elspeth Carmichael Cabot's Soundmain. This yielded more results. Obituaries, mentions in local society pages from decades past. Articles about the historical society inheriting the house. Nothing about a specific doll, Nothing about curses or blind artisans. Elspeth appeared merely as an eccentric but respected local figure. Her overactive imagination, seemingly confined to private conversations and perhaps her will's cryptic phrasing. Frustration began to build. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, forcing herself to think logically. The note. Lila. She sees. And the place Elspeth's stories always seem to circle back to. The place whispered like a half-forgotten nursery rhyme. Black Creek Hollow. Black Creek Hollow, New England. The results were fewer now, more obscure. Mentions in old geological surveys, references to a small, mostly defunct township somewhere near the New Hampshire border, descriptions of dense forests and rocky terrain. And then, nestled among the dry geographical data, something else. A link to a digitized local history archive, specifically a scan page from a book published in the 1950s titled Folklore and Forgotten Corners of Merrimack County. Sarah clicked, her pulse quickening. The text was dense, the scan slightly blurred, but she scrolled down, searching for keywords. And there it was, a short section titled The Sightless Seer of Black Creek Hollow. The entry was brief, dismissive in tone, lumping the story in with tales of spectral hounds and phantom hitchhikers. It spoke of a woman living in isolation in the hollow during the latter half of the 19th century. It didn't give her name, referring to her only as the blind woman or the artisan. It mentioned her uncanny skill in crafts, particularly doll making, stating local legend claimed her fingers possessed a sight denied her eyes. But the tone darkened. It referenced rumors of her bitterness, her reclusiveness bordering on hostility. There were whispers, even then, of unnatural pacts, of her channeling her resentment and pain into her creations. The entry specifically mentioned a final doll, supposedly her masterpiece, crafted with disturbing lifelikeness, rumored to be a vessel for her frustrations. The author quickly dismissed these as typical rural superstitions, blaming loneliness and hardship for the dark legends surrounding the woman. But one sentence leaped out at Sarah, chilling her despite the academic distance of the text. Locals claimed the doll's eyes, crafted with unusual care from imported glass, seemed to follow one, and that misfortune clung to the object like the hollow's persistent damp. Misfortune, clinging to the object. Sarah stared at the screen, the words swimming before her eyes. This wasn't just Elspeth's fanciful storytelling. It was documented, albeit as folklore. Driven by a new urgency, Sarah searched specifically for blind artisan Black Creek Hollow doll curse. This yielded even less, mostly broken links, references to defunct paranormal forums, and vague blog posts rehashing local legends. But one that caught her eye, a post on a genealogy forum from several years prior. Someone was asking about ancestors from Black Creek Hollow, mentioning a family story about a cursed doll made by a blind relative connected to the Carmichael family lineage. The poster's username was Cabot Soundist. Cabot Sound, Elspeth's home. Could this be the historical society? Or someone connected to it? The post was old, the user inactive for years. But there was an email address listed in the profile. With trembling fingers, Sarah composed a message. She kept it brief, cautious, not wanting to sound unhinged. She introduced herself as Elspeth Carmichael's grandniece, mentioned inheriting personal effects, including an antique doll possibly originating from Black Creek Hollow, and asked if the user had any information regarding the doll's history or the blind artisan legend. She hesitated before hitting send, a wave of self-consciousness washing over her. What if they thought she was crazy? What if it was a dead end? But the alternative, living with the gnawing fear and uncertainty under the doll's silent, watchful gaze, was worse. She sent the email, the soft click of the mouse echoing loudly in the quiet apartment. After sending the message, a strange mix of relief and heightened anxiety settled over her. Taking action felt better than passive fear, but she had also potentially opened a door, invited scrutiny, sought out the darkness she simultaneously feared. She glanced back at Lila on the bookshelf. The doll sat immobile, its porcelain face serene, its glass eyes reflecting the glow of the laptop screen. Yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it knew. It knew she was digging into its past, trying to unravel its secrets, and it was waiting patiently. The phrase she sees seemed less like a description now, and more like a statement of fact, a quiet assertion of its power. What exactly did Lila see? Did she see Sarah's fear? Did she see the dawning horror in her eyes as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place? Did she see the future, the misfortune the old book warned of? The air in the apartment felt thick, stagnant. Sarah suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to get out, to escape the confines of the room and the doll's oppressive presence. She grabbed her keys and practically fled, needing the anonymity of the bustling city streets, the noise, the crowds, anything to drown out the silence and the imagined whispers emanating from the shelf. But even amidst the throngs of people on the Boston sidewalks, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation of cold, glass eyes following her every move. The Weaver's secret, whatever it was, felt less like a historical mystery and more like a tightening web, and Sarah feared she was already caught fast within its sticky threads. The city noise offered only a temporary reprieve. The jostle of crowds, the glare of headlights, the cacophony of urban life. They were a thin shield against the internal disquiet. Every shop window mannequin seemed to catch her eye, their fixed stares momentarily morphing into Lila's unsettling gaze. Every overheard snippet of conversation seemed to hold hidden meanings, whispers just for her. By the time Sarah returned to her apartment building, exhaustion warred with a persistent, thrumming anxiety. The elevator's ascent felt agonizingly slow, each floor number lighting up like a countdown. Opening her apartment door required a conscious effort of will. She pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find Lila standing just inside, waiting. The living room was as she'd left it, steeped in the artificial twilight of drawn blinds against the evening sky. And there, on the bookshelf, sat the doll, motionless, upright, exactly as she had positioned it after the incident the night before. Relief warred with a strange sense of disappointment. Had she hoped for proof? For some undeniable sign that would validate her terror and banish the corrosive doubt? She avoided looking directly at it, busying herself in the kitchen, making tea she didn't want, rinsing dishes already clean. The silence of the apartment pressed in, amplifying the small sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under her weight. It felt different now. This silence, charged, expectant, as if the very air held its breath, waiting. She found herself listening intently, straining to catch the faintest rustle, the softest sigh. She kept the kitchen light on, a small bastion against the encroaching shadows in the living room where Lila held court. It was nearly midnight when she finally forced herself to check her email again, perched nervously on the edge of her sofa, casting frequent, uneasy glances towards the bookshelf. She scrolled through junk mail, work reminders, newsletters. Nothing. Disappointment mingled with a perverse sense of relief. Maybe it was a dead end. Maybe she could just get rid of the doll. Sell it, donate it, even throw it away, despite the strange reluctance she still felt. Cut the cord to Elspeth's eccentric legacy and the unsettling folklore it dragged along with it. And then she saw it. A new message, sender listed simply as Arthur Pendleton. Subject line, Inquiry, Carmichael/Black Creek Hollow Doll. Her heart gave a painful lurch. Cabot Soundist. It was real. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. The email was concise, formal, yet carried an undercurrent of something else. Caution, perhaps even weariness. Dear Ms. Carmichael, your email regarding the artifact, sometimes referred to as the Artisan's Doll, reached me via a forwarded query from the Merrimack County Historical Society archives, where I occasionally volunteer. My username on the genealogy forum you mentioned pertains to my own family research, which tangentially intersects with the history of Black Creek Hollow and, unfortunately, with the doll in question. Yes, the legends you reference are known, though often dismissed. The artisan's name is believed to have been Agnes Hildreth. She was indeed blind, exceptionally gifted, and profoundly isolated. The story surrounding her final doll, the one crafted shortly before her death under unclear circumstances around 1888, are particularly persistent. Family lore, including fragments passed down through lines connected to the Carmichaels, Elspeth's branch included, known for holding on to such curiosities, suggest the doll, often called Lila within those circles, is more than just porcelain and thread. The term curse is melodramatic, perhaps, but the object undeniably has a shadowed provenance. Misfortune, psychological distress, unsettling phenomena. These themes recur with unnerving regularity in anecdotal accounts from those who have possessed it. I possess some fragmented records, old letters, and journal entries that touch upon Agnes and the doll. They speak of obsession, of a perceived betrayal linked to the doll's creation, and of a deep-seated bitterness imbued within it. The phrase she sees appears in one letter, attributed to Agnes herself, referring not to the doll's physical eyes, but to something more. I must caution you, Miss Carmichael. While folklore is often embellished, some tales have roots in genuine darkness. Objects can retain echoes of intense emotion, and the doll associated with Agnes Hildreth seems particularly saturated. Treat it with care, or better yet, perhaps consider entrusting it to an institution equipped to handle potentially sensitive historical artifacts. Should you wish to discuss this further, or view copies of the relevant documents I possess, I would be willing, though perhaps reluctant, to arrange a meeting. Sincerely, Arthur Pendleton. Sarah read the email 3 times, the words blurring, reforming, sinking in with chilling weight. Agnes Hildreth, a name for the blind woman, died under unclear circumstances. Perceived betrayal, bitterness imbued within it. She sees, referring not to the doll's physical eyes, but to something more. It wasn't just folklore. This man, Arthur Pendleton, seemingly a historian or at least a serious researcher, acknowledged the darkness, the recurring pattern of distress, the shadowed provenance. His cautious tone, his reluctance, spoke volumes more than the carefully chosen words. His suggestion to entrust it to an institution felt less like practical advice and more like a thinly veiled warning. Get rid of it. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The confirmation was terrifying, validating her deepest fears. The doll wasn't just creepy, it was potentially dangerous, a vessel carrying the century-old rage and pain of its tormented creator. The incident the night before, the tilted head, the watchful stare, snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. It wasn't her imagination. It was Agnes, or whatever echo of Agnes resided within Lila. She looked over at the bookshelf. Lila sat there, bathed in the glow of the laptop screen filtering across the room. Her painted smile seemed wider now, triumphant. Her glass eyes glittered, and Sarah could have sworn, just for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, that the tiny chip in the left iris pulsed with a faint, internal light. She sees. Sees what? Sees Sarah's dawning comprehension? Sees her fear? Sees the misfortune waiting in the wings? The apartment suddenly felt claustrophobic, suffocating. The air crackled with unseen energy. Arthur Pendleton's offer to share documents, to discuss further, hung in the air. It was an invitation to delve deeper into the darkness, to uncover the full story of Agnes Hildreth and her curse. Part of her wanted to slam the laptop shut, delete the email, take the doll out to the dumpster right now. But another part, the part that had driven her to research in the first place, felt compelled to know more. What betrayal, what unclear circumstances surrounded Agnes's death? Understanding the source of the curse felt like the only potential path to combating it, or at least surviving it. Her gaze flickered back to the doll. As she watched, unable to look away, a faint sound reached her ears, almost too soft to discern over the pounding of her own heart. A tiny, rhythmic click, like a fingernail tapping gently against glass. It seemed to be coming from the bookshelf, from Lila. Click, click, click. Sarah froze, straining to hear. unsure if it was real or auditory hallucination. The sound stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving only the oppressive silence. But Sarah knew what she had heard. It was the sound of acknowledgement, the sound of patience running out. The weaver's secret was beginning to unravel, and the first threads were tightening around Sarah's throat. She had to contact Arthur Pendleton again. She had to know everything. The faint clicking sound, whether real or imagined, shattered the last vestiges of Sarah's hesitation. It was a tiny noise, yet it resonated with chilling implication, a deliberate signal, a punctuation mark at the end of Pendleton's warning. The doll wasn't just passively holding Agnes's bitterness. It was aware. It was responding. The idea sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her, overriding the instinct to flee. Running wouldn't work. Ignoring it wouldn't work. Hiding it might only provoke something worse. Understanding felt like the only weapon she might possess, however flimsy. With renewed, albeit terrified, resolve, Sarah turned back to the laptop. Thank you for your prompt and informative response. Your insights confirm some unsettling experiences I've had since inheriting the doll. The history you mentioned, particularly regarding Agnes Hildreth and the circumstances surrounding the doll's creation and her death, is something I feel compelled to understand more fully. I would be very grateful for the opportunity to meet with you and view the documents you mentioned. Please let me know what time and place might be convenient for you. I am available to meet at your earliest convenience. Thank you again for your assistance. Sincerely, Sarah Carmichael. She reread the message, checking for any hint of hysteria, any word that might make Pendleton dismiss her as just another overly imaginative descendant spooked by an old toy. Satisfied it struck the right balance between concerned inquiry and rational discourse, she clicked send. The soft whoosh of the email, disappearing into the digital ether, felt momentous. A step taken onto a path from which there might be no easy return. The wait for his reply was excruciating. Sarah paced the confines of her apartment, unable to settle. Sleep was unthinkable. Food held no appeal. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every random noise amplified into a potential threat. She found herself constantly glancing towards the bookshelf, tracking Lila's position with obsessive vigilance. The doll remained stubbornly immobile, its porcelain face a mask of infuriating serenity. Yet its stillness felt different now, not passive, but coiled, like a predator waiting patiently for its prey to make a mistake. The air around it seemed to shimmer almost imperceptibly, charged with a static energy that made Sarah's teeth ache. She tried distracting herself with work, opening her work laptop, but the reports and spreadsheets swam meaninglessly before her eyes. Her focus remained tethered to the doll and the impending meeting with Pendleton. What would his documents reveal? Would they offer a way to contain or neutralize the doll's influence? Or merely catalog the suffering of past owners? Late the following afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the blinds, striping the floor with bars of light and shadow, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Pendleton. Ms. Carmichael. Very well. Given the nature of the materials, perhaps a neutral and somewhat private setting would be best. The archives section of the Boston Athenaeum Library allows for quiet research. Would tomorrow afternoon, say 2 p.m., work for you? I can reserve a small study corral. Regards, Arthur Pendleton. The Boston Athenaeum, an imposing, venerable institution filled with the weight of history and quiet scholarship. It seemed an appropriately atmospheric, yet safe, setting. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. It was settled. Sarah quickly typed her confirmation, her fingers surprisingly steady. Knowing the when and where provided a small anchor in the swirling sea of her anxiety. The intervening hours crawled by. Sarah found herself obsessively cleaning her apartment, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, rearranging objects, needing the illusion of control over her environment as her internal world spiraled. She packed and repacked her bag for the meeting. Notebook, pens, phone, wallet. Mundane items that felt utterly inadequate for confronting a potentially supernatural curse. Several times, she caught herself standing before the bookshelf, staring at Lila, a silent confrontation passing between them. The doll's glass eyes seemed to absorb the light, reflecting nothing back but an unnerving depth. "What do you want?" Sarah thought, the question a silent scream in her mind. What did Agnes want? The doll offered no answers, only its persistent, placid smile. That night, sleep offered little respite. Her dreams were chaotic and disturbing, filled with images pulled from Pendleton's email and her own burgeoning fears. She saw a dark cottage shrouded in mist, heard whispers in an unfamiliar, harsh cadence. She saw hands, gnarled and pale, shaping clay with obsessive intensity. She saw glass eyes, startlingly blue, staring out from an unfinished porcelain face, filled not with serenity, but with cold, calculating fury. She woke up repeatedly, gasping for air, the echoes of the whispers seeming to linger in the corners of her room. Each time, her first action was to check the living room. Lila remained on her shelf, undisturbed. But the oppressive feeling in the apartment had intensified, thickening into an almost tangible presence. It felt like disappointment emanated from the doll, a silent rebuke for seeking outside help, for trying to expose its secrets. Morning arrived gray and overcast, mirroring Sarah's mood. She dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing subdued, professional attire, wanting to present an image of calm competence she definitely didn't feel. As she prepared to leave, grabbing her bag from the chair, she paused at the door, her gaze drawn irresistibly back to the bookshelf one last time. Lila sat there, bathed in the flat gray light filtering through the window. For a terrifying instant, Sarah thought she saw the doll's head move, a minuscule, almost imperceptible turn towards her. She blinked, her heart pounding. It was still, facing forward, just a trick of the light, a projection of her own frayed nerves. Surely, but the doubt lingered, cold and sharp. Was the doll watching her leave? Did it approve or disapprove of this meeting? Or was it simply waiting for her return, waiting to see what new knowledge she would bring back into its sphere of influence? Taking a shaky breath, Sarah pulled the door shut behind her, the click of the lock sounding unnervingly final. She was stepping out of the doll's immediate physical presence, but she had the distinct, horrifying feeling that she wasn't truly leaving it behind. Its gaze, cold and assessing, followed her down the hallway, down the elevator, and out into the gray, indifferent city. The Weaver's secret awaited her at the Athenaeum, and Sarah couldn't shake the premonition that pulling on those threads might unravel far more than just the doll's history. It might unravel her entire world. Chapter 3. Shattered Reflections. The Boston Athenaeum rose before Sarah like a fortress of knowledge, its imposing granite facade a stark contrast to the churning chaos within her. Pushing through the heavy revolving doors felt like crossing a boundary into another time, the hushed reverence of the interior immediately palpable. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax polish, and the quiet dignity of accumulated centuries. Marble busts regarded her with blank-eyed indifference from shadowed alcoves, and the echoing click of her own heels on the polished floor seemed indecorously loud in the profound stillness. It was a place built for contemplation, for the careful dissection of history and literature. Yet Sarah felt profoundly out of place, her raw, modern fear an alien intrusion in this bastion of learned calm. She approached the main desk, her voice barely a whisper as she gave her name and stated her appointment with Arthur Pendleton. The librarian, a woman with silver hair coiled neatly at her nape, consulted a ledger with a brief, non-committal glance before directing her towards a secluded reading area on an upper floor. The study Carell Pendleton had reserved was tucked away in a quiet corner, flanked by towering shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes whose gilt titles gleamed faintly in the dim light. A man sat waiting at the small table, silhouetted against the tall, arched window overlooking the granary burying ground. As Sarah approached, he rose to greet her. Arthur Pendleton was perhaps in his late 50s, lean and slightly stooped, with thinning gray hair combed meticulously across his scalp and spectacles perched low on his nose. He wore a tweed jacket slightly rumpled, elbow patches and all, looking every inch the dedicated, perhaps slightly obsessive, independent scholar. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, were sharp and assessing, holding a weary intelligence that seemed to take in Sarah's anxious state with a single, swift glance. His handshake was dry and cool, his grip surprisingly firm. "Ms. Carmichael," he said, his voice softer, less formal than his email suggested, yet retaining that undercurrent of caution. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He gestured towards the opposite chair, then resumed his own, indicating a worn leather satchel resting on the table beside him. "I brought the relevant materials I mentioned. Primary sources mostly fragile things, both physically and perhaps psychically." He offered a thin, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, acknowledging the strangeness of his own words. "Before we delve in, perhaps you could tell me, briefly, what prompted your inquiry beyond mere inheritance?" Your email hinted at unsettling experiences. Sarah hesitated, the hushed sanctity of the Athenaeum making her experiences feel even more outlandish, more difficult to articulate without sounding hysterical. But Pendleton's gaze, though weary, held no judgment, only a kind of resigned understanding. Taking a deep breath, she recounted the events of the past week, starting with the doll's unnerving presence, the feeling of being watched, the misplaced objects, and culminating in the terrifying incident where she found the doll slumped forward, its head tilted, seemingly staring directly at her. She described the profound coldness of the porcelain, the clicking sound she'd heard after receiving his first email. As she spoke, she kept her voice low, conscious of the library's silence. But the intensity of her fear bled through her careful words. Pendleton listened patiently, his expression unchanging, occasionally making a small, non-committal noise. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't react with surprise or disbelief. When she finished, the silence stretched for a moment, heavy with unspoken implications. "Yes," he said finally, adjusting his spectacles. "That aligns depressingly well with the anecdotal patterns. The feeling of being watched, the subtle manipulations of the environment, the doll appearing to move. These are recurring motifs in the fragmented accounts associated with Lila. It seems Agnes poured more than just skill into her creation. She poured her will, her awareness, distorted as it may have become." He carefully opened his satchel and began laying out several items on the table. A slim, leather-bound journal brittle with age, a sheaf of letters tied with faded black ribbon, and a few tintype photographs encased in protective sleeves. The objects radiated an aura of antiquity and sorrow. "Agnes Hildreth," Pendleton began, gently pushing the journal towards Sarah, though keeping his hand protectively near it. "Born 1848, lost her sight completely by age 10 due to scarlet fever. An intelligent, sensitive child, by all accounts, who turned her focus inwards, developing an extraordinary tactile sense. Her family, respectable farming folk, were initially supportive, but as she grew older, her isolation deepened. Black Creek Hollow was remote even then. She had little contact with the outside world beyond necessary trade." He tapped the journal. This belonged to her younger sister, Clara, who visited occasionally. It provides glimpses, though often filtered through Clara's own conventional piety and, frankly, fear of her sister's intensity. Sarah tentatively reached for the journal, its leather cover cracked and dry. The pages were thin, yellowed, filled with dense, looping script, faded but mostly legible. Pendleton guided her to a specific section. Clara visited Agnes in the spring of 1887, about a year before Agnes's death. She writes about finding Agnes increasingly consumed by her work, specifically one particular doll. Sarah began to read Clara's neat, slightly slanted handwriting. "April 14th, 1887. Visited Sister Agnes today. The hollow feels colder this year. Or perhaps it is only the chill emanating from the cottage. Agnes works relentlessly, her hands never still. She speaks little, and when she does, her voice has a sharpness I do not recall from youth. Her current project consumes her utterly, a doll of remarkable aspect, near 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin so fine it mimics life, and eyes of startling blue glass ordered special for Boston. She calls it Lila. When I asked whom it represented, she gave a thin smile and said only, "She is the daughter I was denied, the eyes I lack, the witness who will see all." Her intensity is frightening. She keeps the doll near her always, speaking to it, as if it were alive, turning its head this way and that. At night, I hear her whispering in the workshop long after the lamp should be out. I fear her isolation has curdled her spirit. Sarah looked up, her own blood running cold, speaking to it as if it were alive, turning its head. The description resonated with terrifying familiarity. She was already treating it as more than an object, Sarah whispered. It seems so, Pendleton agreed gravely. He slid one of the tintypes across the table. It showed a stern-faced woman with dark hair pulled back severely, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were clouded, sightless, but her face held a fierce intelligence mixed with something harder, resentment, perhaps. This is believed to be Agnes Hildreth, taken sometime in the 1870s, before the obsession fully took hold. Perhaps, but the intensity is already there. Sarah stared at the image, at the woman who had poured her soul, her bitterness, into the object currently sitting on her bookshelf. There is an undeniable resemblance in the set of the jaw, the high cheekbones, to the porcelain features of Lila. The doll wasn't just a generic creation. It was a distorted self-portrait, imbued with its maker's spirit. Pendleton drew her attention back to the journal, flipping forward several pages. Clara visited again later that summer. Things had deteriorated. August 2nd, 1887. Returned to the hollow against my better judgment. Found Agnes much changed. Thin, pale, burning with a feverish energy. She speaks constantly of betrayal now, though names no names. Rants against the sighted fools who cannot comprehend true vision. The doll Lila is finished. It sits upon a chair in the main room, dressed in fine lace. Its aspect is unnerving. Agnes claims it watches, learns, remembers. She says, Lila sees their true hearts, Clara. She reflects their hidden ugliness. I saw her myself, standing before it, arguing with it, as if settling a score. She turned its head sharply towards the window at one point, saying, See how they ignore what is right before them. I confess, when her back was turned, I felt the doll's eyes upon me, cold and judgmental. I left after only one night, making my excuses. The air in that cottage suffocates. I fear for Agnes's soul, and almost for my own. She reflects their hidden ugliness. The phrase struck Sarah like a physical blow. Shattered reflections. The chapter title echoed with chilling clarity. Was that the doll's purpose? To act as a mirror, reflecting back the darkness within those who possessed it, amplifying their fears, their flaws, their latent anxieties until they shattered? It explained the insidious nature of its influence, the psychological decay Pendleton had mentioned. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a targeted, internal assault. Sarah thought of her own recent anxieties, her sleeplessness, her growing paranoia. Was Lila feeding on them, magnifying them, using her own mind against her? The thought was terrifying, making her feel exposed and vulnerable even here, pages and decades removed from Agnes Hildreth's rage. The quiet, scholarly atmosphere of the Athenaeum suddenly felt fragile, permeable. The shadows pooling under the bookshelves seemed deeper, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, back in her apartment, cold glass eyes were fixed unerringly upon her, reflecting her fear back across the city. Sarah looked up from the journal, her face pale, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Reflects their hidden ugliness? She repeated, the words barely a breath. So it's not just haunting, it's actively trying what? drive people mad by showing them the worst parts of themselves. Pendleton nodded slowly, his expression grim. He carefully closed the journal, as if sealing away a tangible darkness. That appears to be the most consistent interpretation drawn from the fragments we have, he confirmed, his voice low. The accounts don't speak so much of spectral apparitions or violent poltergeist activity, though minor physical disturbances aren't unheard of, as you yourself have experienced. The primary manifestation seems to be psychological. Amplified anxieties, paranoia, obsessive thoughts, vivid nightmares that blur into waking life. It preys on insecurities, exacerbates existing conflicts, isolates the possessor. It finds the cracks in a person's psyche and pries them open. Agnes, it seems, crafted a weapon designed for insidious internal warfare. A mirror that forces you to gaze upon your own potential for darkness until it consumes you. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet corral. Your experience with the doll, seemingly moving, it often starts subtly, questioning your own senses, your own sanity. That's the first step in the erosion. Sarah shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. The air conditioning in the library hummed faintly, but the chill she felt was deeper, emanating from the core of her being. The idea of the doll actively probing her mind, searching for vulnerabilities, reflecting her own fears back at her magnified, was almost paralyzing. What hidden ugliness did she possess? What insecurities was Lila already latching onto? Her anxieties about work? Her lingering grief over lost relationships? Her deep-seated fear of ending up isolated, like Elspeth, like Agnes herself? The thought made her feel nauseous. Pendleton seemed to sense her distress. He pushed the sheaf of letters, tied with the faded black ribbon, gently across the table. These might offer more context. He said softly, "They are primarily letters exchanged between Clara and a cousin, Reverend Thomas Ashton, after Agnes's death. They discuss the disposition of Agnes's meager belongings, including the doll, and they touch upon the circumstances surrounding her demise and the betrayal Clara mentioned." With trembling fingers, Sarah untied the fragile ribbon. The paper was brittle. The ink faded in places, but the handwriting, Clara's neat script again, and a more forceful, masculine hand presumably belonging to the Reverend, was mostly clear. She picked up the topmost letter, dated October 1888, several months after the last journal entry she'd read. It was from Clara to Reverend Ashton. "My dearest cousin Thomas, I write to you with a heavy heart, burdened by the sad duty following Sister Agnes's passing last month. The coroner ruled it death by natural causes, a consequence of self-neglect and perhaps the lung fever that swept the county. Yet, Thomas, I cannot shake the feeling that something more unnatural hastened her end. Her isolation had become absolute, her mind consumed by bitterness and perceived wrongs. You recall I mentioned her final creation, the doll she called Lila? It sat beside her bed when the neighbor found her, its glass eyes wide. The neighbor swore the doll's head was turned towards the door, as if watching him enter, though Agnes herself lay cold. He refused to touch it, called it unholy. It now falls to me to manage her effects. The cottage is wretched, filled with dust and despair. And the doll, Thomas, its presence is chilling. I feel its gaze upon me constantly. I find myself thinking dark thoughts, plagued by unsettling dreams since bringing it back to my own home temporarily. Agnes spoke incessantly of betrayal in her last year. Much of it seemed directed towards Mr. Abernathy, the gentleman from Boston who commissioned several pieces from her a few years prior, praising her skill, visiting the hollow, filling her head. Perhaps, with notions beyond her station. Agnes believed he had promised more patronage, perhaps even companionship, only to abruptly cease contact. She felt mocked, used. She poured all that fury, all that wounded pride into Lila. She told me once, in a rare moment of coherence, that Lila would bear witness and deliver recompense where Agnes could not. I fear she imbued the wretched thing with her vengeful spirit. What am I to do with it, Thomas? I cannot keep it. Its presence poisons the air, yet destroying it feels perilous. Agnes was my sister, despite everything. Can you offer any counsel? Mr. Abernathy. A name, a specific source for the betrayal. A gentleman from Boston, who had perhaps toyed with the lonely artisan's hopes before abandoning her. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for Agnes, quickly followed by a renewed wave of dread. A specific target for the bitterness, a concrete reason for the rage trapped within the doll. Did that make the curse stronger, more focused? Did Lila still carry that specific grudge, looking for echoes of Abernathy, or perhaps just men like him, in her subsequent owners? Sarah, working in the cutthroat marketing world of Boston, knew plenty of Abernathy's, charming surfaces masking casual cruelty. She picked up the Reverend Ashton's reply, his handwriting bold and authoritative. My dear cousin Clara, your distress is understandable. The poor woman lived a life shadowed by affliction and isolation. It is perhaps unsurprising her mind turned towards darkness and obsession in the end. As for the doll, such objects can indeed become foci for unhealthy sentiment, even seeming to possess a malevolent influence through the power of suggestion and a troubled conscience. Regarding Mr. Abernathy, I made discreet inquiries. He is known in certain circles, a collector of curiosities, with a reputation for being careless with the affections and expectations of those he deems beneath him. It is plausible he trifled with Agnes's hopes. A cruel act, certainly, feeding a lonely woman's delusions for his own amusement or gain. However, we must not give way to superstition. While the doll is undoubtedly an unsettling memento of Agnes's tragic state, attributing conscious malice or vengeful power to his perilous folly, self-neglect and fever claimed your sister, Clara, not a cursed artifact. Yet, if the object causes you such profound distress, perhaps it is best removed from your sight. Do not destroy it. That smacks of the very superstition we must guard against and might trouble your conscience further. Perhaps placing it in storage, out of sight and mind, or donating it anonymously to an institution less sensitive to its provenance. Distance may diminish its perceived power over your thoughts. Focus on prayer, Clara. Trust in providence, not in the morbid fancies born of grief and isolation. Sarah frowned. The Reverend's rational tone felt dismissive, patronizing even. He acknowledged Abernathy's cruelty but downplayed the doll's potential agency, attributing everything to suggestion and grief. Distance may diminish its perceived power. Had it worked? Clearly not, as the doll had eventually found its way to Elspeth, and now to Sarah. The curse hadn't been diminished by distance or time. It had merely lain dormant, waiting for a new hand, a new mind to latch onto. As Sarah read, a low hum seemed to fill the air in the corral, distinct from the library's ambient noise. It wasn't loud. More of a vibration felt deep in her chest, like a distant, idling engine. She glanced up at Pendleton, wondering if he noticed it too. He was watching her intently, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. Did he hear it? Or was it just her, the doll's influence, reaching her even here, manifesting as auditory hallucination? The air felt heavy again, charged just like in her apartment. The scent of dust and old paper seemed stronger, mingled now with that faint, dry floral scent, desiccated potpourri she associated with Lila. Her heart began to pound. She forced her attention back to the letters, needing to ground herself in the text. There were several more, detailing Clara's increasing desperation to be rid of the doll. Her descriptions of escalating nightmares, feelings of being watched, and small, unsettling incidents mirroring Sarah's own. Objects moved, doors found ajar. She eventually passed it on to another relative, washing her hands of it, but her relief was short-lived. Her final letter to the Reverend spoke of continued unease, a lingering feeling of being tainted by her association with Agnes's creation. Even though it is gone from my house, Clara wrote, her handwriting noticeably shakier. I still feel its eyes upon me in the night. I see reflections in windows in polished surfaces that looked disturbingly like its face. I fear, Thomas, that Agnes's bitterness has left a stain not just on the doll, but on our bloodline. A shadow passed down. A shadow passed down. The words resonated with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just about possessing the doll. It was about the connection, the lineage. Elspeth had it. Now Sarah had it. The reflection wasn't just in the doll's eyes. It was manifesting around the owner. Sarah thought of the moments she'd caught strange movements in her peripheral vision at home, the feeling of a presence just behind her shoulder. And just now, the hum, the scent. Were they real? Or was her mind, under the doll's subtle assault, starting to project its influence onto her surroundings? Was she beginning to see Lila's reflection everywhere? Suddenly, the lights in the corral flickered. Once, twice. Then they steadied again. Sarah jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips. Pendleton looked up sharply towards the light fixture, then back at Sarah, his face etched with concern. Power fluctuations happen in old buildings, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The weariness in his eyes seemed deeper now, tinged with something akin to fear. Nevertheless, Ms. Carmichael, perhaps we should conclude for today. I believe you have seen enough to understand the gravity, the nature of the influence you are dealing with. The pattern is clear. The reflections, they only grow stronger, more intrusive. The longer one remains exposed. He began carefully gathering the documents, his movements precise but hurried. Sarah felt frozen in her chair. The brief flicker of the lights feeling like a direct response, a warning. Lila knew where she was, knew what she was learning, and she didn't like it. The quiet sanctuary of the Athenaeum no longer felt safe. It felt like the doll's reach had extended even here, shattering the illusion of distance, reflecting its cold, malevolent presence in the flickering lights and the sudden, suffocating weight in the air. Leaving the library wouldn't be an escape. It would just be returning to the source. The shattered reflections were closing in. The flickering lights, followed by Pendleton's abrupt suggestion to conclude, jolted Sarah from her frozen state. The scholarly detachment of the Athenaeum had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of intrusion. Lila's influence wasn't confined to the apartment. It was a tether stretching across the city, tightening around Sarah as she uncovered its secrets. Pendleton's haste in gathering the precious documents wasn't just academic caution. It felt like a practiced retreat. The reaction of someone who knew, perhaps from personal experience, when to disengage from the doll's orbit. Yes, Sarah agreed, her voice strained. Yes, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. This has been illuminating and terrifying. She watched him carefully place the journal and letters back into the worn leather satchel, securing the buckles with decisive clicks. The simple action felt like sealing away a Pandora's box, though Sarah knew the contents were already loose in her own mind. Illuminating, terrifying, and regrettably consistent, Pendleton murmured, snapping the satchel shut. He rose, adjusting his tweed jacket. Miss Carmichael, I cannot advise you strongly enough. The accounts, fragmented as they are, suggest a pattern of escalation. The phenomena tend to become more pronounced, more personalized, the longer the connection persists. Clara's fear of a stain on the bloodline might be dramatic, but the psychological toll is undeniable. Consider Reverend Ashton's advice, however dismissively delivered. Distance, if not physical, then perhaps emotional. And seriously consider finding a secure, institutional home for the artifact. Some university archives or specialized museums have protocols for handling objects with sensitive histories. He hesitated, then added, his voice barely above a whisper, though even then, there are no guarantees. No guarantees. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken warnings. Even locked away in an archive. Could Lila's influence truly be contained? Or would it simply wait, patiently, for another susceptible mind, another descendant perhaps, to stumble across its path? They walked together in silence towards the library exit, the hushed grandeur of the building feeling oppressive now, the marble bust seeming to watch them with ancient, knowing eyes. The earlier hum had ceased, the air felt lighter, but the residue of the intrusion lingered, a faint static charge. As they reached the main foyer, Pendleton paused near the entrance. "One more thing," he said, turning to face her, his expression etched with a deep, almost painful seriousness. Agnes's bitterness wasn't solely directed at Abernathy. Clara's journal hints at other perceived slights, other resentments festering in her isolation. The doll, Lila, she doesn't just reflect your hidden ugliness, Miss Carmichael. She carries the echoes of Agnes's own perceived flaws, her rage at her blindness, her loneliness, her frustrated ambitions. It's a complex, toxic brew. Be mindful of your own thoughts, your own frustrations. Don't feed it. Don't give it ammunition. His warning struck a deep chord. Sarah thought of her own recent frustrations, annoyances at work, fleeting moments of professional jealousy, impatience with the demands of city life. Were these the vulnerabilities Lila was probing? Was the doll subtly twisting her own everyday stresses, weaving them into the fabric of Agnes's century-old rage? The idea of her own mind becoming a battleground, her emotions weaponized against her by a porcelain doll, was sickening. "Thank you, Arthur," Sarah said, the formality dropping away in her distress. "Thank you for showing me this. I need to think about what to do." Pendleton gave a curt nod, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer, filled with a mixture of scholarly concern and something that looked unsettlingly like pity. "Be careful, Sarah," he said quietly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians on Beacon Street, leaving Sarah alone on the steps of the Athenaeum, the weight of his warnings pressing down on her like the heavy, overcast sky. The journey back to her apartment was fraught with a new kind of tension. Every reflection she caught, in shop windows, bus shelters, the polished chrome of passing cars, seemed to hold a flicker of movement, a distortion that hinted at Lila's face superimposed over her own. She found herself deliberately avoiding reflective surfaces, keeping her gaze fixed firmly ahead, yet the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. It wasn't just the doll's eyes anymore. It felt like the city itself was watching her, its glass and steel surfaces potential conduits for Lila's malevolent gaze. When she finally reached her apartment door, her key trembled in the lock. She pushed the door open cautiously, bracing herself. The apartment was silent, still. Lila sat on the bookshelf, exactly where she had left her. But the atmosphere was different. The air felt thick, charged, humming with a low-frequency energy that vibrated in Sarah's bones. The faint, dry floral scent was stronger now, cloying and funereal. And the doll, its serene expression seemed stretched, taut, like a mask barely concealing a simmering fury. Its glass eyes seemed darker, colder, holding chips of Arctic ice. It knew she had sought help, that she had uncovered its secrets, and it was waiting. Sarah walked slowly into the living room, unable to tear her gaze away from the doll. She stopped a few feet from the bookshelf, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Agnes?" she whispered, the name feeling strange and dangerous on her tongue. "What do you want?" There was no audible reply, only the oppressive silence. But as Sarah watched, transfixed by a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the light reflected in Lila's left eye. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a flicker, like a distant candle flame cupped within the glass. And then, slowly, horrifyingly, a thin, hairline crack appeared on the doll's smooth porcelain cheek, starting near the corner of the eye and branching downwards like a tiny, frozen tear track. It wasn't damage from age or mishandling. It felt like a physical manifestation of the doll's, of Agnes's displeasure, a warning etched onto its own face. Sarah stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The crack seemed to pulse faintly, a dark line marring the doll's perfection. It was a violation a visible sign of the stress fractures appearing not just on the porcelain, but within Sarah's own reality. The reflections weren't just metaphorical anymore. They were shattering, literally and figuratively, right before her eyes. The doll wasn't just reflecting ugliness. It was inflicting damage, marking its territory, demonstrating its power. Pendleton's warnings echoed in her ears. Escalation. More personalized. Don't feed it. But how could she not react? How could she maintain distance when the curse was actively manifesting, scarring the very object of its power, mirroring the fracturing of her own sanity? The apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and Lila, the silent, smiling jailer, was tightening her grip. The shattered reflections were no longer just glimpses. They were becoming her reality. The sight of the crack snaking across Lila's porcelain cheek broke through Sarah's fear-induced paralysis, triggering a raw, primal urge to flee. She stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the area rug, catching herself against the arm of the sofa before she could fall completely. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale thick with the cloying, funereal scent that now seemed to emanate directly from the doll itself. The crack wasn't large, barely thicker than a human hair, yet it seemed to pulse with a dark energy. A visible scar, not just on the porcelain, but on the very fabric of reality within the apartment. It was a deliberate mark, an accusation, a chillingly tangible manifestation of Agnes Hildreth's century-old displeasure. You sought knowledge. You sought help. See the consequence. The message resonated in the suffocating silence, clearer than any spoken word. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for she didn't know what. Escape? Reassurance? But everything looked subtly wrong, distorted, as if viewed through a heat haze. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, coalescing into watchful shapes. The familiar pattern on the wallpaper seemed to subtly writhe in her peripheral vision. The air grew colder, a damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the building's heating system and everything to do with a malevolent presence radiating from the bookshelf. It felt like the apartment itself was mourning, or perhaps being suffocated by the doll's expanding influence. Sarah pressed her trembling hands against her mouth, trying to stifle the panicked sobs rising in her throat. Pendleton's warnings hammered at her mind. Escalation. Personalized. Don't feed it. But how could she not react? How could she remain emotionally distant when the curse was physically scarring the object before her eyes, mirroring the cracks appearing in her own composure? She scrambled upright, keeping the sofa between herself and the bookshelf, her gaze locked on the doll. Lila remained still, the crack a stark, dark line against her pale cheek, her blue glass eyes fixed forward, yet somehow managing to convey an aura of cold, triumphant malice. The serene smile looked grotesque now, utterly detached from the visible evidence of its contained fury. It was the smile of a tormentor enjoying its victim's fear. Sarah felt trapped, cornered in her own home. The urge to cover the doll, to hide it away, was overwhelming. Yet the thought of touching it now, especially after seeing the crack appear, filled her with a paralyzing dread. What would happen if she touched it? Would the crack spread? Would the coldness she'd felt before intensify, leaching the warmth from her very soul? Or worse, her gaze flickered towards the dark screen of her television, mounted on the opposite wall. For a horrifying instant, she saw a reflection, not the dim outline of the room behind her, but Lila's face, cracked cheek and all, staring back at her from the black glass. She gasped, jerking her head away, her heart slamming against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, then forced herself to look again. The screen was blank, reflecting only the vague shapes of the living room. Had she imagined it? Another hallucination? Or was it a true reflection, a glimpse into the doll's expanding reach, its ability to project its image, its presence onto other surfaces? Shattered Reflections. The chapter title wasn't just about internal states. It was becoming literal. The boundaries were blurring, Lila's image bleeding into the world around Sarah, threatening to overwrite her own reality. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. She needed air, needed distance, even if Pendleton's words suggested true distance was impossible. Grabbing her keys from the small table near the door, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, she practically bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back at the bookshelf, yet feeling the doll's cold, cracked gaze following her every step. She didn't bother with the elevator, taking the stairs two at a time, the rhythmic thud of her own footsteps echoing the frantic pounding in her chest. Outside, the gray afternoon was fading into a damp, misty evening. The city lights blurred through the drizzle, casting long, distorted reflections on the wet pavement. Sarah walked aimlessly, needing movement, needing the anonymity of the faceless crowds, but finding no solace. Every puddle seemed to hold Lila's watching eyes. Every store window threatened to reveal the cracked porcelain face instead of her own reflection. She found herself drawn towards the Charles River, the wide expanse of dark water offering a semblance of open space, a contrast to the claustrophobic confines of her apartment. She stood by the railing, the damp wind whipping strands of hair across her face, staring into the choppy, gray water. What could she do? Pendleton's advice echoed. Institutional home. Distance. But how could she simply hand this malevolent object over to unsuspecting museum curators or archivists? Wasn't that just passing the curse along? Condemning someone else to this psychological torture? In his final words, no guarantees. Even locked away, could its influence truly be contained? Clara's fear of a stain on the bloodline suggested the connection might be deeper, more personal, tied to her lineage, making disposal less straightforward. Destroying it seemed like the most direct solution, the most final. Smash the porcelain, burn the cloth body, obliterate the vessel. The thought brought a surge of fierce, desperate energy. But Clara's reluctance, Reverend Ashton's warning against superstition, and a deeper, colder fear held her back. What if destroying the vessel didn't destroy the entity within? What if it only released it, untethered, free to latch onto her directly, without the buffer, however horrific, of the physical doll? Agnes had poured her will, her awareness, herself into Lila. Destroying the doll might be akin to destroying Agnes all over again, potentially provoking a far worse retribution. The clicking sound she'd heard, the crack appearing, these felt like warnings against defiance. No, destruction felt too risky, too unpredictable. Containing it seemed impossible. Passing it on felt irresponsible. She was trapped in a horrifying checkmate, orchestrated by a 19th century blind woman and her porcelain effigy. As she stared into the dark water, another image surfaced from Pendleton's documents. Agnes, standing before the doll, arguing with it, turning its head sharply. See how they ignore what is right before them. Agnes had communicated with it, treated it as a confidant, an extension of her own will. Perhaps the key wasn't in fighting it directly or trying to escape it, but in understanding how Agnes had imbued it with power. What was the mechanism of the curse? What bound Agnes's spirit, or its echo, to the object? Unraveling the stitches, Sarah thought. The title of the next chapter floating into her mind. If she could understand how the curse was woven, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to unpick the threads. It was a fragile sliver of hope in an overwhelming sea of fear, but it was something. It required facing the doll again, studying it, perhaps even attempting to communicate with it, trying to understand the source of its power beyond just Agnes's bitterness towards Abernathy. It meant delving deeper into the darkness, not shying away from it. It meant returning to the apartment, to the cracked face and the watchful eyes, and confronting the Weaver's secret head-on. Turning away from the river, Sarah started walking back towards her apartment, her steps slow but deliberate. The fear hadn't lessened, the dread still coiled tightly in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a desperate resolve. The reflections might be shattering around her, but she wouldn't let herself shatter completely. Not yet. She had to understand. She had to unravel the stitches before the entire tapestry of her sanity came undone. The cracked doll waited, and Sarah knew, with chilling certainty, that their confrontation was far from over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 4. Unraveling the Stitches. Returning to the apartment building felt like willingly stepping back into a predator's den. The familiar lobby, usually a neutral space, seemed imbued with a watchful quality. The security camera above the mailboxes feeling less like a deterrent and more like an unblinking eye allied with the one waiting upstairs. Sarah's hand was clammy as she pressed the elevator button, the ascent punctuated by the frantic thumping of her own heart. Each floor passed felt like shedding another layer of the fragile resolve she'd gathered by the river. By the time she reached her floor, the corridor stretched before her like a shadowy gauntlet. Unlocking her door, she pushed it open slowly, hesitantly. The air that flowed out from the apartment wasn't just stale. It was cold, unnaturally so, carrying that thick, cloying scent of dead flowers and dust. It clung to the back of her throat, tasting of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood or rust. She stepped inside, forcing herself to close and lock the door behind her, the click echoing ominously in the heavy silence. Her gaze immediately flew to the bookshelf. Lila sat exactly as she had left her, the crack on her cheek stark against the pale porcelain. If anything, the crack seemed darker now, less like a fresh fracture and more like an old scar, livid and deliberate. The doll's glass eyes, reflecting the dim hallway light spilling into the room, seemed fixed on her, pools of midnight blue holding no warmth, only a chillingly calm assessment. Sarah took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs. Fight or flight had warred within her earlier, leading to panicked retreat. Now a third instinct, fragile but insistent, took precedence. Investigate. Understand. Unravel. Pendleton's documents had provided the who and Agnes Hildreth, her bitterness, her perceived betrayal. But the how remained elusive. How had Agnes imbued an inanimate object with such persistent, malevolent consciousness? What specific ritual, what specific materials, what confluence of emotion and intent had woven this curse so tightly? Steeling herself, Sarah walked slowly towards the bookshelf, her shoes silent on the rug. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning the doll minutely. The crack was the most obvious change, a blatant violation of the doll's previous perfection. But were there other, subtler shifts? She couldn't be sure. The serene smile still seemed fixed, mocking. The lace dress, though faded, remained pristine. The silky dark hair cascaded around the porcelain shoulders, undisturbed. Yet, the entire object radiated a palpable energy, a low hum of wrongness that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing, making the fillings in Sarah's teeth ache. "All right, Agnes," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible even to herself. "You wanted a witness. You wanted someone to see. I'm looking. Show me. How did you do this?" The silence that answered her was profound, heavy, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Yet, as she stood there, focusing her intent, trying to project calm inquiry rather than fear, she noticed something. The air directly around the doll seemed to shimmer, almost imperceptibly, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. And the cold intensified, focusing into a tight sphere around the bookshelf, making her shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't just watching, it was reacting to her presence, her attention, her words. Remembering Clara's journal entry, eyes of startling blue glass ordered special from Boston. Sarah leaned closer, focusing on Lila's eyes. They were uncanny in their lifelikeness. The irises detailed with subtle color variations, the pupils dark and seemingly deep. The tiny chip near the iris of the left eye, the one that seemed to pulse with light sometimes, drew her gaze. Was there something special about the glass? Some specific property? Or was it what lay behind the glass? She thought of Agnes, blind, her world defined by touch and sound, pouring her essence, her sight, into this creation. Were the eyes merely symbolic, or were they functional in some esoteric way? Conduits? Reservoirs? Her gaze traveled to the doll's hair. It felt disturbingly real when she'd first unpacked it. Was it actually human hair? Whose? Agnes's own? Or someone else's? The thought sent a fresh wave of revulsion through her. Binding spells. Folk magic. Didn't they often involve personal elements like hair or blood to strengthen the connection? She resisted the urge to touch it again, recalling the profound chill from her first contact. Instead, she made a mental note. Investigate 19th century doll-making materials, particularly high-end or custom work. What was considered special glass from Boston back then? Were human hair wigs common for dolls of this quality? Next, she examined the dress. Cream lace, tiny seed pearls, exquisite workmanship. Clara had mentioned Agnes's skill. Was there anything hidden within the folds? Any symbol stitched into the lining? Any object tucked away? Reaching out hesitantly, her fingers trembling, Sarah gently lifted the hem of the doll's lace skirt. Underneath, the cloth body was tightly stuffed, firm and dense. The fabric was plain, sturdy muslin, yellowed with age. No había simbes, no hidden paquets. She ran her fingers lightly over the torso, feeling the tightly packed stuffing beneath the cloth. What was it filled with? Traditional wool or cotton, or something else? Agnes's cottage was in a hollow known for its dampness, its strange flora. Had she used local herbs, plants known in folklore for certain properties? Or worse, something organic, personal? The thought of what might lie beneath the muslin skin made her snatch her hand back, bile rising in her throat. As she stepped back from the bookshelf, trying to calm her racing heart, her laptop, sitting closed on the nearby coffee table, suddenly whirred to life. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the room, momentarily displaying her desktop background before flickering rapidly through a series of distorted images. Flashes of Agnes's stern face from the tintype, the interior of a dark, cluttered workshop, a close-up of a staring blue glass eye, before settling on a single, stark image, the crack on Lila's cheek, magnified, filling the entire screen. Sarah choked back a scream, stumbling away from the coffee table. The laptop wasn't even plugged in. She always shut it down completely, never left it in sleep mode. There was no reason for it to turn on, let alone display those specific, horrifying images. It was the doll. It had to be. It was accessing technology, projecting its displeasure, its warning, directly onto her screen. Stop digging. The message was unequivocal. Panic clawed at her throat again, threatening to overwhelm her fragile resolve. This wasn't just subtle, psychological manipulation anymore. This was overt, technological interference, a clear demonstration of power extending beyond mere atmosphere and perception. Pendleton's warnings about escalation slammed into her with renewed force. She was provoking it, and it was pushing back harder. She stared at the laptop screen, at the magnified image of the crack, feeling utterly exposed, utterly violated. Her sanctuary wasn't just invaded. It was compromised. Her own technology turned against her. The doll on the shelf seemed to watch her reaction, its cracked face radiating a cold, calculating satisfaction. The shimmering in the air around it intensified. The low hum vibrated more strongly, and the cloying floral scent thickened, becoming almost suffocating. Unraveling the stitches was proving far more dangerous, far more interactive than Sarah could have possibly imagined. The weaver wasn't just guarding her secrets. She was actively fighting back. And Sarah was trapped in the room with her, the threads tightening with every passing second. The image of the crack dominating her laptop screen acted like a splash of icy water, snapping Sarah out of her investigative trance and back into raw, visceral fear. Lila wasn't just a passive vessel of Agnes's rage. It was an active, malevolent intelligence capable of manipulating the modern world in ways that defied rational explanation. The subtle disturbances, the psychological pressure, those were bad enough. But hijacking her laptop? That was a terrifying escalation, a violation that felt deeply personal and technologically intimate. It demonstrated a reach, a power, that felt boundless and utterly uncontrollable. Sarah backed away further, putting as much distance between herself and both the doll and the laptop as the confines of the room allowed. Her breath hitched in her throat, her mind racing. How was it doing that? Wi-Fi? Bluetooth? Some unknown form of energy manipulation born from Agnes's concentrated will? The question was meaningless in the face of the terrifying reality. It was doing it. That was all that mattered. The magnified crack on the screen seemed to pulse faintly, mocking her attempts to understand, to unravel. It was a visual representation of her own fracturing sanity, projected back at her through the cold eye of technology. You think you can understand me? You think you can dismantle my work? You understand nothing. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of decay and Agnes's enduring fury. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image, the scent, the oppressive atmosphere. Don't feed it, Pendleton had warned. Don't react with fear. Don't give it the satisfaction. But how could she not be afraid? How could she remain calm when faced with such blatant, impossible hostility? She forced herself to take slow, deep breaths, try to regain some semblance of control over her runaway panic. Anger, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the fear. Anger at Agnes for creating this monstrosity. Anger at Elspeth for leaving it to her. Anger at the doll itself for its relentless, silent torment. Fine, she whispered, her voice trembling but laced with defiance. She opened her eyes, deliberately avoiding the laptop screen and fixing her gaze directly on Lila. You want to play games? You want to show me how powerful you are? Were you Agnes? Just a bitter old woman hiding inside a doll, afraid to face anything directly. The moment the words left her mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted. The cold became biting, painful, seeping in her bones. The low hum intensified into an audible, dissonant drone that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the picture frames on the wall. The laptop screen flickered violently, the image of the crack dissolving into a chaotic static blizzard before the machine abruptly shut down. The screen going black, and then a sound, a soft, dry rustle like old paper crinkling. It came from the bookshelf, from Lila. Sarah froze, every nerve ending screaming. Slowly, deliberately, the doll's head began to turn, not slumped or tilted this time, but a smooth, mechanical, impossible rotation on its cloth neck. It turned until its blue glass eyes, cold and devoid of any human warmth, were fixed directly on Sarah. The crack on its cheek seemed like a sneer. This was it, the definitive proof, the undeniable manifestation. Not a trick of the light, not a hallucination, not a settling of stuffing. The doll had moved, deliberately, purposefully, in direct response to her challenge. The last shred of Sarah's rational doubt evaporated, leaving only stark, bone-chilling terror. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't scream. She was locked in the doll's unblinking stare. A horrifying intimacy forged across the room. The air crackled with energy, thick and electric. The silence stretched, taut, and unbearable, punctuated only by the frantic drumming in Sarah's ears. Then another sound, faint at first, then growing slightly louder. A soft, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump. It wasn't her own heartbeat. It was slower, heavier, somehow hollower. It seemed to be coming from within the doll itself, from the tightly stuffed cloth body beneath the lace dress. Thump-thump, thump-thump, like a faint, trapped pulse, or the echo of a heartbeat long silenced. The sound, more than the turning head, more than the hijacked laptop, sent a wave of absolute horror through Sarah. It suggested something fundamentally, primordially wrong. Not just trapped consciousness, but a grotesque mimicry of life, a perversion of the natural order bound within the porcelain and cloth. What had Agnes truly done? What abomination had she created in her desperate loneliness and rage? The thump-thump grew slightly louder, more insistent. It felt like a summons, a dark invitation. Come closer. It seemed to whisper beneath the sound. Listen to the heart of the curse. Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the doll's face, from those cold, staring eyes that seemed to see straight through her, into the terrified core of her being. The urge to flee warred with a morbid, horrified curiosity. What was making that sound? What lay beneath the stitches of that muslin body? What secret was held within the doll's hollow heart? The decision was ripped from her. With another soft rustle of lace, the doll's right arm, previously resting limply at its side, began to lift. Slowly, jerkily, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings, the porcelain hand rose, fingers slightly curled, until it was pointing directly at Sarah. An accusation, a judgment, a designation. You. That was the breaking point. The sight of that pointing finger, combined with the relentless, hollow heartbeat, shattered Sarah's remaining composure. A choked scream tore from her throat as she finally broke eye contact, spun around, and lunged for the apartment door. She fumbled frantically with the locks, her fingers clumsy with terror, expecting at any second to feel cold porcelain fingers clamp onto her shoulder. The thump-thump seemed to follow her, echoing in the charged air. Finally, the locks gave way. She wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the relative safety of the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her, not caring who heard, not caring about anything except putting distance, however temporary, between herself and the horrifying animation within her apartment. She leaned back against the door, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face, listening. The heavy thumping sound had stopped. Silence pressed in from the other side of the door. But she knew it wasn't over. She had pulled too hard on the threads, provoked the weaver. And now the stitches weren't just unraveling. They were actively fighting back, revealing a depth of malevolence, an unnatural life, far worse than she could ever have imagined. Chapter 5. Empty Sockets. Sarah didn't stop running until she hit the street, bursting out of the building's main entrance into the indifferent anonymity of the Boston night. Rain had started to fall again. A cold, persistent drizzle that plastered her hair to her face and soaked through her thin jacket, but she barely noticed. The terror was an inferno within her, overriding physical discomfort. She leaned against the cold, wet brick of the building next door, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. The image of the doll's pointing finger, the sound of that grotesque, hollow heartbeat, they were seared in her brain, playing on a horrifying loop. She couldn't go back there. Not now. Not ever. The apartment wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to Lila, to the vengeful spirit of Agnes Hildreth. It was a contaminated space, a focal point for a curse that was rapidly escalating beyond anything she could handle alone. Pendleton's warnings, Clara's terrified letters, her own escalating experiences, they all pointed to an inevitable, terrifying conclusion. The doll wouldn't stop until it had completely consumed her sanity, her life, just as it had presumably preyed on others before her. Where could she go? Friends? Family? How could she possibly explain? Hi, sorry to drop in, but I'm being tormented by a haunted, 130-year-old doll that can control electronics and has a creepy heartbeat. They'd think she was insane, have her committed. And maybe she was going insane. The thoughts circled, insidious, fueled by the doll's psychological warfare. Was this the final stage? Making her doubt her own perceptions so completely that she isolated herself, making her an easier target? No. The turn head, the laptop, the pointing finger, the sound, those felt terrifyingly real, external intrusions, not internal delusions. She clung to that certainty, a fragile anchor in the storm of her fear. She needed help, but not the kind doctors or therapists could provide. She needed someone who understood the nature of the darkness she was facing. Someone like Arthur Pendleton. He had warned her, shown her the history, acknowledged the reality of the doll's influence. He was her only hope. Pulling out her phone with shaking hands, she fumbled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Pendleton's number. It felt like a desperate, last resort. What could he even do? He was a scholar, a researcher, not an exorcist or a ghost hunter. But he knew. He might know someone who could help, or have some insight, some obscure piece of lore that offered a way out, a way to sever the connection, to silence the hollow heartbeat. Taking a ragged breath, she pressed call. It rang several times, each ring echoing the frantic pulse in her ears. Just as she was about to give up, convinced he wouldn't answer, the call connected. Pendleton. His voice answered, cautious, weary, instantly recognizable. Arthur, it's Sarah Carmichael, she choked out, leaning heavily against the wet brick wall for support. I'm sorry to call so late. But it's worse. Much worse. It moved. Its head turned. It pointed at me. There was a sound, Arthur, like a heartbeat coming from inside it. And it took control of my laptop. I had to get out. I ran out. I can't go back there. The words tumbled out in a frantic rush, barely coherent, fueled by adrenaline and terror. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only with the faint hiss of static and the sound of Sarah's own ragged breathing. Then Pendleton sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. I feared as much, he said quietly. Direct confrontation often provokes decisive responses. The heartbeat, yes, that is mentioned in one particularly obscure, fragmented account I didn't show you. Considered too apocryphal, too disturbing. It seems Agnes's methods were more visceral than mere transference of will. He paused again. Where are you now, Sarah? Outside my building. On the street. I don't know where to go. All right. Stay calm. Or as calm as you can be. Do not go back inside the apartment. Not alone. Is there a coffee shop nearby? Somewhere public, well-lit, where you can wait. Sarah glanced down the street through the rain. There was an all-night diner a block away, its fluorescent lights casting a pale, watery glow onto the wet sidewalk. Yes, a diner. Good. Go there. Get inside, order something hot. Try to steady yourself. I need to make a call. There is someone I consult occasionally on matters that stray beyond conventional historical research. Someone who deals with the practical application of containing such influences. No promises, Sarah, but given the escalation, drastic measures may be warranted. Stay put. I will call you back or meet you there as soon as I can. The line clicked dead before Sarah could even reply. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered within her. Someone who deals with practical application. It sounded ominous, terrifying, yet infinitely better than facing Lila alone. Clutching her phone like a lifeline, Sarah pushed herself away from the wall and stumbled towards the diner, the fluorescent glow a beacon in the rainy darkness. Inside, the diner was warm, smelling of stale coffee and frying bacon. A few late-night patrons nursed mugs at the counter, lost in their own worlds. Sarah slid into a booth in the corner, ordering tea she didn't think she could drink. Needing the warmth of the mug in her trembling hands. She huddled there, watching the rain streak down the windows, jumping at every unexpected noise, her eyes constantly scanning the other patrons. Half expecting to see Lila's reflection in the polished chrome napkin dispenser or Agnes's stern face staring back from the eyes of the tired-looking waitress. The minutes crawled by, each one an agony of suspense. What if Pendleton couldn't reach his contact? What if they refused to help? What if Lila's influence extended beyond the apartment, preventing help from reaching her? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her phone buzzed. It was Pendleton. Sarah, his voice was urgent. My associate, a woman named Eleanor Vance, is willing to assess the situation. She has experience with artifacts of this nature. She advises immediate action. We need to return to your apartment. Now. Return? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through Sarah. Go back there. It's necessary, Pendleton insisted. Eleanor believes the primary locus of power must be confronted directly, and certain preparations must be made within the space itself. She says leaving the artifact unattended, especially after direct provocation, could allow its influence to spread, to root itself more deeply. We need to act while it's contained, focused. I'm on my way to you now. Eleanor will meet us there. Please, Sarah. It's the only way. Fear warred with the desperate need for a solution. Returning to that apartment. to the doll with the hollow heartbeat and the pointing finger, felt like walking willingly into her own grave. But Pendleton sounded convinced, and this Eleanor Vance, whoever she was, represented her only chance. Taking a shaky breath, Sarah agreed. Pendleton arrived minutes later, his face pale and grim in the diner's harsh light. He offered no comforting words, only a brief, worried glance as they hurried back out into the rain. The walk back to her building was conducted in near silence, the air thick with unspoken fear and anticipation. As they approached the entrance, another figure emerged from the misty gloom, a woman, older than Pendleton, perhaps in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, her gray hair pulled back severely. Dressed in practical, dark clothing, she carried a heavy-looking canvas bag. This, presumably, was Eleanor Vance. Her presence radiated an aura of quiet competence and unnerving calm, a stark contrast to Sarah's frantic terror and Pendleton's scholarly anxiety. "Ms. Carmichael," Eleanor said, her voice crisp and authoritative, offering a brief, firm nod instead of a handshake. "Arthur has briefed me. Time is of the essence. Let us proceed." The three of them entered the building, the elevator ride-up punctuated only by the frantic pounding of Sarah's heart. As they reached her floor and walked towards her apartment door, Sarah could feel the oppressive atmosphere thickening, the unnatural cold radiating outwards, pushing against the mundane reality of the hallway. Eleanor paused before the door, closing her eyes for a moment as if sensing the energy within. "Potent," she murmured, her eyes snapping open. "Sharp and focused, and deeply rooted." Agnes put a great deal of herself into this. More than just will. Pieces. She glanced at Sarah. "Courage, child. What lies within feeds on fear. Starve it." Then she nodded to Pendleton, who produced Sarah's key, his hand trembling slightly as he unlocked the door. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped inside first, her movements deliberate, confident. Pendleton followed, gesturing for Sarah to stay close behind him. Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat, then forced herself over the threshold, her eyes immediately seeking the bookshelf. Lila sat exactly where Sarah had last seen her, head turned, arm outstretched, porcelain finger pointing directly at the spot where Sarah now stood. The crack on her cheek seemed darker, whiter. The air in the room was freezing, thick with the scent of decay and vibrating with that low, dissonant hum. But the horrifying thump-thump sound was absent. Silence. A heavy, watchful, malevolent silence. Eleanor Vance ignored the doll for a moment, her gaze sweeping the room, assessing. She opened her canvas bag, revealing not arcane artifacts, but items that looked surprisingly practical. Rolls of metallic tape, small electronic devices Sarah didn't recognize, jars of powders and salts, and a thick, leather-bound book that looked far older and more worn than anything Pendleton possessed. "Arthur, the containment grid," Eleanor instructed, handing him the tape and one of the devices. "Perimeter first. Seal the thresholds, door, windows." Pendleton nodded grimly and set to work, applying strips of the metallic tape along the doorframe and windowsills with practiced efficiency. Eleanor turned her attention back to Lila. She approached the bookshelf slowly, her eyes narrowed, studying the doll with an intensity that made Sarah hold her breath. She didn't touch it, didn't speak to it. She simply observed, her expression a mixture of clinical assessment and profound gravity. "The eyes," Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. Clara mentioned special glass. "It acts as a focal point, a lens for Agnes's awareness. And the body, the heartbeat you heard, suggests an organic component. Something ritually preserved, perhaps, binding her life force. What remained of it to the vessel?" She opened one of the jars, revealing coarse black salt, and began to carefully trace a circle on the floor around the bookshelf. Her movements precise and economical. As Eleanor worked, the doll remained motionless, its arm outstretched, its gaze fixed. But the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, more charged. the silence stretching taut, like the moment before a lightning strike. Sarah could feel the doll's malevolent attention focused entirely on Eleanor, assessing this new intrusion. This unexpected resistance. Eleanor finished the salt circle and stepped back, producing the old leather-bound book from her bag. She opened it, flipping through brittle pages filled with dense, archaic script and strange diagrams until she found the section she sought. She began to chant, her voice low but resonant, filling the small apartment with syllables that felt ancient, alien, yet possessed of undeniable power. The words were in a language Sarah didn't recognize, perhaps Latin, perhaps something older, but the intent was clear: binding, sealing, banishing. As Eleanor chanted, the doll began to vibrate. A low, guttural moan seemed to emanate from its porcelain lips, a sound of pure, thwarted rage. The outstretched arm trembled violently. The temperature plummeted further, frost beginning to bloom in the corners of the room despite the closed windows. The lights flickered wildly, threatening to plunge them into darkness. Sarah pressed herself back against the wall near Pendleton, who had finished sealing the thresholds and now stood watching Eleanor, his face a mask of terrified hope. The chanting grew louder, more forceful. Eleanor's face was etched with concentration, sweat beading on her forehead despite the intense cold. The doll's vibrations increased, the entire bookshelf rattling. The crack on its cheek seemed to glow with a faint, dark light. The guttural moan intensified into a high-pitched shriek of fury that scraped against Sarah's nerves, making her want to cover her ears and scream. Suddenly, with a final, resonant syllable from Eleanor, the doll went rigid. The vibrating stopped. The shriek cut off abruptly. The outstretched arm dropped limply back to its side. The lights steadied. The intense cold began to recede slightly, though the air remained unnaturally chilled. Silence descended once more. But it felt different now, less watchful, more subdued. Empty. Eleanor closed the book, breathing heavily, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Contained, she stated, her voice strained but firm. Temporarily. The binding holds the core influence within the vessel, prevents it projecting outwards. But the link, the curse itself, is not broken. Not yet. She turned towards the doll, her expression grim. Lila now sat slumped forward slightly, her head bowed, her eyes seemingly dull, lifeless. The crack remained, a permanent scar. But the animating presence, the malevolent awareness, felt dampened, recessed. To truly break it, Eleanor continued, looking from the doll to Sarah, we need to sever the anchor. The organic component. The heart, so to speak. She paused, her gaze sharp. And we need to address the eyes. They're the windows Agnes uses to perceive, to project. They must be closed. The implication was horrifyingly clear. They needed to physically breach the doll, to remove whatever grotesque secret lay within its core, and to destroy the eyes that had watched generations succumb to madness. It felt like a desecration, a violation, yet utterly necessary. Ow! Sarah whispered, dread coiling in her stomach. Eleanor picked up a small, sharp tool from her bag, something resembling a surgical scalpel. Carefully, she said, her voice grim. And quickly, the binding weakens the entity. But it won't hold indefinitely if we disturb the vessel directly. Arthur maintained the perimeter. She approached the bookshelf, stepping carefully over the salt line. With meticulous precision, Eleanor made a small incision in the doll's cloth torso, just below the lace bodice. Sarah watched, horrified yet unable to look away, as Eleanor probed gently within the opening. Her expression tightened. "Ah," she murmured. "As I suspected." She withdrew the scalpel, and held within its tip was something small, dark, and shriveled. It looked disturbingly like a desiccated piece of organ tissue, wrapped tightly in dark thread, with faint, spidery runes barely visible upon its surface. Agnes's anchor, ritually preserved, likely her own tissue, given freely in rage and pain. Working swiftly, Eleanor placed the grotesque object in a small lead-lined box from her bag, snapping the lid shut. The moment it was sealed away, the doll seemed to slump further, as if a final animating spark had been extinguished. "Now," Eleanor said, turning her attention to the doll's head, the eyes. She raised the scalpel again. This felt like the final violation, the ultimate blinding of the blind woman's curse. Just as Eleanor's scalpel touched the edge of the first glass eye, a final, desperate surge of energy pulsed from the doll. The lights flickered violently one last time, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint city glow from the window. A wave of intense cold washed over them, accompanied by a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to echo from the very walls, curling directly into Sarah's ear. "Never free." Then silence. The lights came back on, dimmer than before, flickering slightly. Eleanor stood motionless for a second. Then, with grim determination, she carefully pried the first glass eye from its socket. It came free with a soft pop. She dropped it into a prepared cloth pouch. She repeated the process with the second eye. Lila now sat slumped on the shelf, headless almost, her face dominated by two dark, empty sockets. The cracks seemed less significant now, overshadowed by the profound emptiness of the gaze. The malevolent presence was gone, the humming silence replaced by a truly dead stillness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind only the lingering chill and the faint, unpleasant scent. "It is done," Eleanor breathed, stepping back from a bookshelf, wiping the scalpel clean. "The primary vessel is neutralized. The anchor severed, the windows closed." She looked at Sarah, her sharp eyes softening slightly with something akin to sympathy. "The curse's power is broken, its focus shattered. But echoes remain. History leaves scars, Miss Carmichael, on objects, on places, on bloodlines." Sarah stared at the doll, at the empty sockets staring back into the room. It looked pathetic now, violated a mere husk. The terror that had consumed her for weeks began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of sorrow. Sorrow for Agnes, for Clara, for Elspeth, for herself, for all the lives touched and twisted by this legacy of pain. What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "The doll itself should be properly disposed of," Eleanor stated. "Incineration is best, along with the contents of this box." She held up the lead-lined container holding Agnes's anchor. "The salt and binding agents will dissipate, but the space should be cleansed. Arthur can advise on that." She began packing her bag, her work complete. "As for you, Sarah, you are free from its direct influence. But be mindful. Such experiences leave their mark. The reflections you saw, some may linger in your own mind. Heal. Live. Do not let Agnes's bitterness claim another victim, even in memory." Eleanor Vance and Arthur Pendleton handled the final disposition, taking the mutilated doll and the lead-lined box away, leaving Sarah alone in her apartment, which felt simultaneously empty and profoundly haunted by the memory of what had transpired. The chill remained, a faint reminder, as did the faint, cloying scent. The bookshelf looked bare, the space where Lila had sat radiating a palpable emptiness. Sarah sank onto her sofa, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her weak and trembling. She was free. The blind woman's curse was broken. Yet, as she sat there in the heavy silence, staring at the empty space on the shelf, Eleanor's final words echoed. "History leaves scars, echoes remain." Looking towards the darkened window, she caught her own reflection in the glass. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she didn't see her own eyes staring back, but two dark, empty sockets. She blinked, and the illusion vanished, leaving only her own tired, tear-streaked face. But the chilling reminder lingered. The curse was broken, but the echoes might haunt her forever. And so, the curse is broken, or is it merely dormant? What do you think? Did Sarah truly escape the blind woman's curse? Or will the echoes continue to haunt her? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This tale, The Blind Woman's Curse, was a chilling journey into the heart of obsession and inherited darkness. If you felt that icy grip of fear, if you found yourself glancing nervously at the shadows in your own room, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Eli Nightfall and ringing that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next descent into terror. Sharing the video with fellow horror lovers also helps spread the nightmares. Thank you for listening, for braving the darkness with me. Until next time, stay vigilant and perhaps check your reflections carefully. Good night.